Lord King, Mervyn King, who was governor of the Bank of England through the good years and the bad years in the decade up until 2013. He was at the midst of many of the traumas of the time and wrote his account of what had gone wrong in a book published last year, The End of Alchemy. But it's been a long year and a lot has happened since, so the new paperback version of the book has a preface updating us on Lord King's views. He is, for example, more comfortable with Brexit than most other economists. I sat down with him earlier today. First, does he have any worries about Theresa May triggering Article 50 later this month?
Well, it's bound to be a complex process. So my biggest concern is not about the challenge of Brexit as such, but about whether we're going to make the decisions early enough that would enable us to make the practical planning that is important. If we're going to leave, I think we should have a simple, clean Brexit and to minimise the scale of the negotiation. There's a danger that we won't make progress in negotiations, at least within the 2-year horizon. But what follows from that is not that we say, OK, we'll give in to everything that the other side demands, is that we say these are the things that are under our control, and a clean Brexit is under our control. And there will be things that we'll want to discuss, but we have to minimise the area of negotiation. And I think the government also has to point out the potential opportunities that Brexit gives. We could restructure the way we give subsidies to agriculture. We could, for example, in Northern Ireland, which is a problem that I think deserves more attention than it's getting at present, try and have a conversation with the government south of the border. And I know they were very nervous about the Brexit outcome. I was there just before the referendum. And say to them, can we find a way of shifting the tax and tariff border from the land frontier to the sea frontier, while not disturbing the political arrangements? I think it's in everyone's interest to have an imaginative discussion about where we could go.
Well, you mean basically have a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain?
And a tax, there's no reason why the rate of corporation tax in Northern Ireland has to be the same as in the rest of the United Kingdom, once we have the freedom to do that.
Just one specific one on trade, because a lot has been said about the potential for a UK-US trade deal of some kind. Would such a deal benefit the UK's trade balance or the US trade balance? Because my slight feeling is that both sides are thinking we'll sign all these deals, we'll suddenly be exporting more and bring our country into better balance. But both of us have the same problem, and I'm not sure which one of us would benefit.
We in the UK need to do something about our trade deficit. It's almost 6% of GDP. This is a massive figure. And my biggest worry about economic policy in the next few years is that all the politicians seem obsessed with Brexit. And actually the biggest problems we face now are not Brexit. It's about how we can reduce the trade deficit, how we're going to save enough as a nation to pay for our pensions, because the pension scheme has deteriorated over the last 25 years. How are we going to save enough to pay for care for the elderly when we will become so old that we need that support? How are we going to finance the NHS? These are the big economic challenges. And if politicians ignore those and focus only on Brexit for the next 2-3 years, then I think those big questions will not receive the attention which they deserve.
And you think they might be giving too little weight to those while their mind is off elsewhere?
Well, it's clear that their mind is now completely on Brexit, and I think that's unfortunate.
I just want to briefly talk about Scotland, which you mention in your book. You say it would have been perfectly viable as a nation at the time of the last referendum. Project Fear perhaps was overdone at the time of the last referendum. The oil price is much lower now. The revenue Scotland would derive from oil is much lower. Do you still think Scotland would be viable as a nation?
Well, of course, Scotland certainly could be an independent country. There are plenty of small countries the same size as Scotland. Scotland has both the people, it has the capital city, the history, the culture. It could be an independent country. The question is, does it want to be, given the consequences of it? Now, I myself don't think there are any major problems in terms of currency. That was the thing that Project Fear focused on last time. But there is an issue about public finances. And if the oil price remains low, and if they lose the money which is transferred from the rest of the United Kingdom to Scotland, then they would have to make that up in their own budget. But that's a consequence of deciding to be financially independent. You end up paying for yourself. And it would be a challenge, I think, to borrow on the international market if Scotland decided to run a large budget deficit. I think that would be expensive. The interest rate would go up. But that's one of the consequences of saying, look, if we want to be independent, we have to accept the consequences.
What about the banking system? I mean, Donald Trump, one of the things he has said he wants to do is revise Dodd-Frank, the big post-crisis regulatory change in the US. He thinks it's getting in the way. He wants a more deregulated environment. A, is that the right approach? And B, are you worried about the fragility of the global banking system still, which is a sort of 2 years on since you wrote the first edition of your book?
So I think that there is an argument which can be made to support part of the move that President Trump wants to make, which is we've made the regulatory system incredibly complex. People who work in banks have to go to their compliance officer before they can do anything. What regulators have done is to produce literally tens of thousands of pages of regulations and say, well, you must obey each of these. And they've done it in order to prevent a repetition of what happened before. But of course, the next financial crisis that comes along won't look quite like the one that happened before.
Are you scared of any banks having a run on them in the next couple of years?
Well, not in the UK or the US, no. But I think that elsewhere in the world, there have to be concerns about the banking system. In Europe, the banking system is still fragile. We've seen concerns about the financial sector in China. There are other parts of the world. And I think the thing that everyone needs to be concerned about is if you get a serious problem in the banking sector in one part of the world, it can quite easily lead to problems in the banking system elsewhere. So our banks are in good shape. But if there were a serious problem on the continent in Europe, then there would be a blowback to our banking system as well.
Lord King, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for those of you who want to see the director's cut, the full unedited version of that interview, it's up on our YouTube channel now.